if there's one thing I care about a lot, it's climate change. If there's another thing I care about a lot, it's accuracy in media, in major media. There's a website you should know about, first of all, called FAIR, FAIR.org. I think it stands for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. It's a great website. I read it all the time. You should too. And my next guest has written there at fair.org about the media and its role in climate change. And as she writes, due to their corporate conflicts of interest, trusted news authorities have diverted us from our primary responsibility, assuring a viable habitat for our children and grandchildren. Great sentence, and so I welcome her now, Alison Rose Levy. So first of all, Alison, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, delighted to be here with you, Richard.
Good to have you. And secondly, first of all, let's start with this. What inspired you to write this piece?
You know, I think I've been percolating it for a long time because, you know, we're in a time where there are people who really understand the role of media influence, and there are other people who are just kind of blindly following along with whatever is presented and quoting authorities whom I know from my reporting experience have been anywhere from silent to omitting to, you know, and all in all really negligent in reporting on key issues related to environment and climate that I have reported on over the last decade. And this was particularly a shocking wake-up call for me because I originally trusted in these very, you know, mainstream establishment outlets. And one of the reasons is that I worked for one of them for several years at CBS. So, you know, people are like, why are you surprised? Well, you know, we're all on different points of really coming to terms with what it means to have a corporate-owned media. And it means a lot in terms of our ability to act on climate.
You know, I want to get to that, but to get to that, we have to kind of, if you don't mind, explore this corporate-owned media piece. As you point out, Bill Moyers used to say, you know, there were I forget how many, 90 news companies in the country 40 years ago. Now there are 6, as you point out. Now there are 5, actually, major news corporations in this country. But a lot of people hear that and they say, well, why does that really make a difference? As long as the CEO of, you know, whatever corporation owns outlet X doesn't walk into the newsroom and say, cover this, don't cover that, you can't cover this that way. You know, in other words, I guess what the question is how does corporate ownership actually alter the content of what we read or watch?
Right. Well, I mean, there are two parts to your question. One is it can alter what an outlet will cover or won't cover. And as I document in the piece, these mainstream outlets were very late in the game and allowed fracking to proceed, which I covered from very early years of that whole initiative. They were completely underreporting, omitting, blanking out the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We've seen them misreporting candidates, you know, in terms of their poll results, in terms of ignoring what they say, in terms of claiming that one candidate initiated an idea by another candidate, you know, that another candidate is long on the record for having initiated. You know, so there are many subtle ways, but the idea that, so that's what we see, and we can see it, as I document in the article, over many years. But, you know, the one thing that people imagine is that it's like a movie where, you know, some top flight CEO who flies around on jets comes in and gives an instruction. And that is incredibly naive. I mean, you know, in a movie that may happen, but in real life, as I point out in the article, anyone who works for a large company knows that the top boss isn't there over your shoulder, you know, saying do this and do that. It's just not what happens. You know, there's a direction, and then what happens is there's a culture. We have a culture of accepting that economically beholden media with an agenda is somehow neutral and objective and has no dog in the game. That's a cultural belief or a culture of accepting that. And in the same way, there's a culture within news and media environments. And so to, you know, stay on the job and, you know, be promoted and keep doing what you're doing, people are gradually educated to that culture. They educate others, and it functions as a systemic consensus. It doesn't, there may be times, like as I detail in the article, where, if you go off course and suggest a topic that they never cover, they'll let you know, maybe. But most other times it's just, or no, we don't go for that idea. Or, as I also point out in the article, they fire the sole television host who's regularly covering the Trans-Pacific Partnership. If something like that happens, do you imagine that all the other hosts are kind of going to be, oh, well, I'll pick up where he left off? Of course not. Job survival mitigates against it. And that goes on all the time.
Yeah, I love that you brought up culture, Alison Rose Levy, because I think that plays such a huge part in it. I mean, it's kind of like, that's not how we really think, I mean, obviously the ultimate, like when you have to go beyond the bounds of culture and actually fire somebody for covering the wrong story, that can happen. But so much of the time, I loved your description of the early coverage of fracking as being a Hatfield versus McCoy, the country folks in upstate New York, where I'm from, by the way, but Utica, a city, but those folks are squabbling again over, who drills in whose backyards, like it was the Beverly Hillbillies or something. That's a great example in a couple ways for me. One is because of the kind of urban parochialism and insider parochialism that says a conflict happening out in the countryside somehow can't matter to us, number one. But number two, that's the only, it would never occur to us to take a view, hey, fracking may be fundamentally damaging the environment we live on. It may be creating a 300% increase in earthquakes in Oklahoma or whatever. To even talk about that, even when there's scientific information backing it up, is basically to label yourself. It's to violate a taboo almost. And I think people don't realize how effective that can be in a corporate culture and keeping people in line.
Definitely. I mean, it's absolutely that way. I mean, one of the things, and this was how I got educated to this, and people get educated. They don't want to think that their favorite reporter is, not covering things in an accurate manner. But, when I was in the early years of covering fracking, the New York Times had a reporter who was debunking everything and really taking a pro-industry stance. He was poo-pooing what the general public had to say. And he even, was in favor of methane release and said that the science on it was overestimated or something. In 2020 hindsight, the Paris Agreement relied on that methane science, and it's been vindicated and validated as having been quite accurate. But they got it wrong. And, they never said, we got it wrong. That's the other thing. There used to be something of offering a correction or, apologizing or acknowledging or owning it. But instead, there's a lot of corporate PR that just says, you can trust us. We have the truth. Come here for the absolute knowledge on anything. And no one ever says, oh, we just completely omitted, or got it completely wrong. And that particular reporter, who has since left the Times, was, occupying the central position. And he was supposedly pro-climate. He wasn't a climate denier, and he's still working in media, being paid, I'm sure, 10 times, what any of us who are in independent media receive, And the Times never owned up to that. They never apologized for it. And so there's no reason why people would understand that they're functioning in a business promotional kind of venture, not in a self-critical, analytic, integrity venture.
And that actually gets me to another dimension of this problem. I'm interested in your thoughts about, Alison, and that's the fact that so many of these journalists at prominent outlets rely for their coverage, for their stories, for their quotes on the so-called experts, the insiders, the people who've had senior policy positions in administrations from both parties in the past. So there's this kind of in-group that we were talking about, extends not just within the media industry itself, but between it's almost like a three circles on a Venn diagram of the media industry, political elites, and other corporate and nonprofit elites, all of whom may share a worldview and a culture, and they all sort of feed off and work with one another. So I assume that reporter you describe has survived, among other things, because he lives in that social ecosystem, whereas the rest of us live in something closer to the real world.
That's really true. I mean, in a non-climate example, you can see that bringing on Rahm Emanuel, to talk about the problem with giving, Medicare for all, when he was a principal opponent and architect of the Affordable Care Act and was trying to take down that opportunity at every turn. He's a policy expert on the wrong side of the issue. He's not named as such. He's been voted out of office, and he's there with an agenda. And he was there with Chris Christie. These two caring individuals who really care about Medicare for all and everyone having health care as a right. And they're not identified as such. They're given that seat because they are part of the very ecosystem that you're describing, and they're trusted, and the media environment promotes trust in them and their word by virtue of the fact that they are seated in that seat, they're well lit, they're well dressed and coiffed, and there they are. They must know. And, for people who don't follow the information track and, the bunny trail of information as closely as journalists do, as you or I would, may not be aware of, in fact, their history for being exactly the wrong people to be offering commentary on that topic.
And that same statement can be made about economics. It can be made about military policy. It can be named, you talk about trade policy over and over again. That pattern seems to replicate itself. I just wanted to bring up with you, Alison Rose Levy, one of the things that has driven me a little crazy since Trump was elected about this whole conversation. And that is this. Clearly, there's a proliferation of what we might call fake news through viral sources, social media, and so on. We can debate back and forth, how much comes from where or how much influence it has. But the rise of what is called fake news, meaning, social media, disseminated stories from unknown sources and so on, has given rise to a kind of, on the part of some of the media, the Washington Post now, its slogan is democracy dies in darkness, and somehow they're the bulwarks against this flood of false information coming from Russian bots or whatever. But while I'm concerned about fake news and its new iteration, people like you and me that have been trying to hold the mainstream media's feet to the fire for years now, we need to keep doing that. And somehow it seems that gets lost, or they wrap themselves in the mantle of a journalistic objectivity that I suspect they think they possess, but which in fact they don't possess. Do you get what I'm saying?
Totally. Yeah, totally. No, that's a huge problem. And really, it began almost moments after the 2016 election. And the idea really was initially articulated by Hillary Clinton, who, may not have realized that she was giving Donald Trump a big gift, because then he adopted it and he's run with it. And what I've seen in media and social media is that it makes people afraid of information, which is exactly what you do not want. They're like, oh, I'm a good boy, I'm a good girl. This is not fake news. I would never, and they're on the defensive, rather than having a sense of curiosity, a permission to explore, and with people already being so busy and frantic to survive in this economy and everything, and we know that most people don't closely track these issues. People think that Trump was emerged full blown just from the Electoral College 3 years ago, and it has nothing to do with the neoliberal structures of our society. example, and they don't want to look into the past and see the many decades of precedents for this moment that have led us here. So anything that further deters people, scares them off, puts them on the defensive, gives them ways to sort of shut down being open to different perspectives or information because it might be fake news, is all part of a narrowing of the public mind, a contraction of our ability to know and our right to know what's going on. And in fact, it really violates the traditional function and principles of journalism.
You know, that's a brilliant observation, Alison, and I think it's so important. And unfortunately, we only have a minute or two left, so this may be a little unfair of me, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is I'm going to point out when you said, you know, it makes people afraid of information. Sadly, I think that includes a lot of what you and I might consider our friends and allies who just don't want to go into certain areas of inquiry, especially when it comes to foreign policy, national security, what have you, because they're afraid it might lead them to conclusions that might force them to challenge the bipartisan consensus in areas like national security and elsewhere as well, that both parties until recent years have operated off. And I think that you and I as journalists have a sacred duty to the truth. I also think the progressive movement should feel it has a sacred duty to the truth, but I think sometimes the truth doesn't make us free, or before it makes us free, it makes us uncomfortable. And I'll give you the last word, though.
Well, on that topic, I have to point out that at the debates, we had a whole host of candidates, one after another, and if you listen carefully and pay attention, rather than just being dazzled by their charm or their articulateness or personality, you will notice that almost, out of the field of what was originally 20, now being winnowed down, there were very few who didn't at some point stand up and give a military set piece. Oh, ours is the greatest nation.
Right.
We're going to do this for the world. And people just, it goes, right over everyone's head that that's even happening, that we're being, sort of force marched into, a support for the military, when we know, coming back to environment, that military expenditures are really the the military is one of the biggest contributors to climate change. B, those expenses could be best devoted to the vital transition that we need to undertake. And therefore, in the absence of a real debate on climate, but it could even be seen in the town hall, people who are going to be pro-military are by definition further away from really being able to devote the funds to do what's necessary for a real systemic change on climate. And so we could be, sentimentally inspired by Greta Thunberg, I'm not critiquing her at all. I mean, she's performed a wonderful task here, and many people are so inspired. But unless we really have the orientation and the understanding to look a little further, we could think that, a well-intentioned phrase that somebody gives, a pro-militarist gives in a debate, is meaningful in terms of really addressing climate. And we have no interpretation coming from the journalists sponsoring this or in the mainstream media that, no, it isn't actually. The people who are getting up there saying, our great country policing the world, are actually taking an anti-climate mitigation and prevention position, but they're not being called on it.
Well, again, a great point, and I wish we had more time. Alison Rose Levy, journalist, thank you for writing this piece. Thanks for coming on the program, and I hope we'll talk again sometime soon.
I'd love to. Thanks, Richard.